It's one of the biggest games to ever kick off a college football season. It's Clemson versus Georgia, September 4th, 2001. And could the loser of this game possibly already be eliminated from the college football playoff? What's going on, YouTube? This is SG1 Sports, and you're watching our college football channel. We're going to talk about this game and why the loser of this game may not make it into the college football playoff. A lot of people think that this game really doesn't mean anything. The loser of this game, as long as they go out and take care of business, win the rest of their games, they will be in the college football playoff. I think that is the case for Georgia. I think it's not necessarily a must-win for Georgia if they can go out and win the rest of their games. Will that happen? That's going to be tough. For Clemson, if they lose this game, they may be able to win the rest of their games and still not make the college football playoff. And I'm going to show you exactly why that could happen. Now, is it an elimination game? Is your season over if you lose this game? No, but we're talking about if certain things happen the rest of the season, and we're talking about the favorites winning out, the favorites winning every single game this college football season, which could happen. And we talk about these teams, Alabama, Oklahoma, and Ohio State. If they all go 13-0, if they all win all of their games, we're going to talk about this scenario if that happens. And again, Alabama is going to be favored in every game that they play. Will they meet Georgia in the SEC championship? That's the favorites. Georgia, the favorites in the East, Alabama in the West, and they'll meet in the SEC championship if the favorites win out. And Alabama will be favored in that game. I feel pretty confident that the Crimson Tide will be favored against Georgia. Oklahoma is going to be favored in every game that they play. Iowa State's going to be a tough, probably top 10 matchup. And they play them twice. More than likely, will play them twice. But they will be favored in every game that they play. Ohio State will be favored in every game that they play. You know, you've got Oregon on the schedule, Indiana on the road, you've got Penn State. There are some pretty tough games in there, but they're going to be favored in every game that they play. So in this scenario, Alabama goes 13-0, Oklahoma goes 13-0, Ohio State goes 13-0. That means Georgia in this scenario would lose to Alabama in the SEC championship. Obviously, that may not happen. Obviously, Georgia could beat Alabama, and that would change things up here. Then we'll be talking about potentially a 12-1 if Georgia loses to Clemson, a 12-1 Georgia, and a 12-1 Alabama, and we'll go through that scenario here in just a second. So again, let's say all this happens. These three teams all go undefeated, which seems like a stretch. You know, three teams going undefeated, but it absolutely could happen, and we're starting to see less and less parity. At least with the top teams in college football. So it may be tough for a team to beat any of these three teams, and they could all possibly wind up at 13-0. So if Clemson beats Georgia, this is what I think the final standings would potentially look like, assuming all those favorites went out. Alabama would be number 1, Clemson probably number 2. They would have a win over a top 10 Georgia, a top 10 maybe North Carolina or Miami. Their overall schedule might not be quite as tough as Ohio State, but I think they would have more of those big wins, those signature wins, and they're probably going to start the year off ahead of Ohio State. So I think that the committee probably would put Clemson in there at 13-0 at number 2, Ohio State at number 3, Oklahoma number 4. We would have 4 undefeated teams potentially if it goes down like this. Georgia then would have 2 losses. They would have lost to Clemson and then lost to Alabama in the SEC championship. So at best, they would be number 5. They probably would be number 5 unless there is an undefeated Notre Dame or a one-loss Oregon that's a Pac-12 champ. You know, there could be another team there at number 5, but more than likely Georgia would be sitting there at number 5 with a loss to the number 1 and number 2 teams. But you cannot put Georgia in ahead of Ohio State or Oklahoma if they're undefeated. You just can't put a 2-loss team ahead of an undefeated team, even if their 2 losses were to the top 2 teams, especially when you look at the rest of the resume for Georgia. They'd have a win over Florida, Auburn, Kentucky, Missouri. I mean, there's just not going to be enough to even have a discussion on that. So Georgia would be on the outside looking in, which means if Georgia can't beat Alabama, and maybe they can, maybe they can't, but if they can't beat Alabama, then they have to beat Clemson. Now, if they beat Clemson and then lose to Alabama, they've still got a really good shot. So how about if Georgia wins? So if Georgia wins, you would have Alabama, and I'm talking about Georgia beating Clemson. Alabama at 13-0, beating Georgia in the SEC championship. Ohio State, Oklahoma, both undefeated. And that could change depending on where the teams wind up in the final standings, in the final poll. Oklahoma might have a better resume than Ohio State. It depends on how the Big 12 teams do compared to the Big 10 teams. But, they would be 2 and 3, whichever order you want to put them in. And then you would have Georgia and Clemson both at 12 and 1. And this is the debate right here. This is the big one. If Georgia beats Clemson, Clemson wins the rest of their games. Georgia wins the rest of their regular season games, but lose to Alabama. You'd have Clemson, who would be a Power 5 conference champion, an ACC champion, a team that probably would have just beaten a top 10 North Carolina or Miami team. A Power 5 conference champion with one loss, and that one loss coming in week 1 of the season. So you'd have that with Clemson. And on the other hand, you'd have Georgia, a Georgia team that would have lost their last game, would not be a conference champion, but they would have the head-to-head over Clemson. And in this scenario, when you look at the two teams, you look at the two schedules, it would be hard for me to see the committee putting Clemson ahead of Georgia. I believe that head-to-head would be the difference. I think Georgia beating Clemson head-to-head would be enough for Georgia to make it into the college football playoff. This is definitely debatable. I could definitely see both sides of the argument. But at the end of the day, if you're wanting the 4 best teams and Georgia beat Clemson head-to-head and their one loss came to the best team in college football at 13-0. Clemson, if they had played Alabama, they might have lost too. So if it plays out like that, I believe that Georgia would get the nod. We would see Georgia at number 4, Clemson at number 5. Not a guarantee that it would go down like this. Again, Clemson, maybe the committee would look at that conference championship, and maybe it would weigh enough to put Clemson ahead of Georgia. I think Georgia's overall schedule is tougher than Clemson's. So again, I think strength of schedule goes to Georgia, head-to-head goes to Georgia. Clemson does have the conference championship, but I don't think that would be enough. I think that Georgia would wind up there at number 4, Clemson at number 5. So we could have a one-loss Power 5 champion miss out on the college football playoff if it does go like this. And who knows? Maybe Oregon's sitting there with one loss as well, and they would be in that conversation. So what about Oregon? And I didn't really put them in this scenario. What if Oregon was sitting there with one loss and they're a Pac-12 champ? Would their one loss come into Ohio State? That would definitely be interesting, but I still think Georgia would get the nod just because they would have that signature win over Clemson, their one loss coming to the best team in college football, the number 1 team, according to how I think the committee would rank the teams. Even though it's the last game of the season, I think Georgia would be there at number 4 because of that win over Clemson. So that just tells you how important this game is. Georgia versus Clemson, playoff implications possibly. Now, not necessarily. Georgia could lose to Clemson. They could win out, beat Alabama, win the SEC championship. They're in. I think, without a doubt, Georgia would be in that scenario. So they don't have to beat Clemson if they can beat Alabama. But if they can't beat Alabama, they have to beat Clemson. And for Clemson, if they lose to Georgia and win out, they're going to probably need a little bit of help. That's not necessarily going to be enough to guarantee themselves a spot in the college football playoff. So that's why I say this game, when we look at it at the end of the day, when we're putting that field together, we get the playoff rankings, the top 4 teams, we could look back to week 1 and say, if Clemson had beat Georgia, they would have been in the playoff. If Georgia had beat Clemson, they would have been in the college football playoff. So because of that, in a way, this potentially could be a college football playoff elimination game in week 1 of the 2021 college football season. What do you guys think? Do you agree with me? I would love to know your thoughts on the argument with Georgia and Clemson if they both have one loss. If Clemson's the ACC champion, Georgia's not the SEC champion, but Georgia beat Clemson head-to-head. Do you agree with my take on that? I think the committee would go with Georgia, but I'm not real confident. I'm like 60% confident. So I'd love to know if you guys agree with that or disagree with that and just your thoughts on this overall. So let me know down in the comments below. Thank you for watching this video, and stay tuned for more here on the SG1 Sports College Football Channel.